Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Russia's doing it, and if China's doing it, and we're adhering to the agreement, that's unacceptable. So we have a tremendous amount of money to play with on our military, $700 billion plus $716 billion. So Russia has not adhered to the agreement, so we are going to terminate the agreement, and we are going to develop the weapons.
President Trump announces the U.S. will pull out of a landmark nuclear arms pact brokered with Russia more than 30 years ago. Now Russia's threatening to retaliate. Could this spark a new arms race? We'll speak with nuclear disarmament expert Daryl Kimball in Washington, D.C. Then the New York Times exposes a Trump administration memo which they say would define transgender out of existence. We'll speak with ACLU attorney Chase Strangio. Then to the ongoing siege in Gaza after 130 Palestinians were injured Friday while protesting the ongoing Israeli occupation and demanding the right of return. Israel's implemented a zero-tolerance policy towards protesters in Gaza.
The agenda is not only to overcome Palestinian opposition to their oppression, but also to silence Israelis and to silence the international community. So it goes further, right? You know, if an Israeli is against occupation, she or he must be traitors.
We'll speak with Haggai Elad of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, who officially testified in front of the UN Security Council for the first time last week. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's announced plans to pull the United States out of a landmark nuclear arms pact with Russia in a move that could spark a new arms race. President Ronald Reagan and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, or INF, treaty in 1987. The INF banned all nuclear and non-nuclear missiles with short and medium ranges. The treaty helped to eliminate thousands of land-based missiles. Trump spoke about his decision Saturday.
Russia has violated the agreement. They've been violating it for many years, and I don't know why President Obama didn't negotiate or pull out. And we're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to. We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement.
President Trump did not offer details on how Russia was violating the deal. Over the years, Russia has also accused the U.S. of violating the agreement by deploying missiles in Romania. National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's advocated against the treaty, is now in Moscow for talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and President Vladimir Putin. China and France spoke out against the move, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying, quote, the document has an important role in developing international relations in nuclear disarmament and in maintaining global strategic balance and stability. We'll have more on the U.S.-Russia treaty after headlines with Director of Arms Control Association Daryl Kimball. The New York Times reports the Trump administration is attempting to eliminate the rights of transgender people by creating a narrow legal definition of gender. Citing a government memo that it obtained, the Times reports the Department of Health and Human Services has undertaken an effort across several government agencies to establish a definition of sex under Title IX, the federal civil rights law that bans discrimination on the basis of sex. That definition would be either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals a person is born with. The proposal, if enacted, would reverse the expansion of transgender rights that took place under President Obama. Responding to the Times article, hundreds of LGBT activists rallied in New York's Washington Square Sunday night. Groups plan another demonstration today in D.C. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast with the ACLU attorney Chase Strangio. The government of Saudi Arabia has admitted for the first time Saudi journalist, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi is dead. The admission on Friday came after weeks of Saudi denials and shifting narratives on the whereabouts of Khashoggi, who entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul October 2nd and was never seen again. The Saudis now say Khashoggi was killed in a fistfight inside the consulate and that 18 Saudis have been arrested in connection with his death. President Trump on Friday said he found the claim credible, but later shifted his statements as lawmakers from both parties blasted the Saudi claims. This is Tennessee Republican Senator Bob Corker, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, speaking on CNN Sunday.
It's just not a credible story for somebody to walk in with 15 other people and get into a fist fight and lose their life. It's my sense, and I don't know yet, but based on the intel that I've read, based on the other excerpts that I've read, it's my thinking that MBS was involved in this, that he directed this, and that this person was purposely murdered.
President Trump later told the Washington Post their stories are all over the place, but Trump's continuing to resist growing calls in Congress to cut off U.S. weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. And President Trump has questioned whether the killing was ordered at the highest levels of Saudi government. Saudi state media reports both King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Jamal Khashoggi's eldest son over the weekend to express their condolences. Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir offered this account of the killing on Fox News.
First of all, we're not an authoritarian government. We're a monarchy. We have our checks and balances. We have our systems. The individuals who did this outside the scope of their authority. There obviously was a tremendous mistake made, and what compounded the mistake was the attempt to try to cover up. That is unacceptable in any government. These things unfortunately happen.
Turkish officials say Khashoggi was tortured, murdered, dismembered by a squad of 15 Saudi hitmen shortly after entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul October 2nd. New Turkish surveillance video obtained by CNN shows a body double emerging from the consulate just hours after Khashoggi entered the building, apparently wearing the clothes taken off Khashoggi's body, but with mismatched shoes. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has promised to reveal the findings of an investigation on Tuesday. This comes as Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is traveling to Saudi capital Riyadh this week, where he's meeting with senior Saudi officials at an anti-terrorism center run jointly by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Mnuchin had told reporters last week it was premature to even discuss sanctions at this point. Meanwhile, a new report by the New York Times details an online campaign ordered by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to monitor and attack what he considered to be dissident Saudi voices on Twitter. As part of the effort, trolls would harass and silence critical voices, including Jamal Khashoggi's posts critical of Saudi Arabia's military attacks in Yemen would be reported as sensitive, which can result in the posts being removed by Twitter. The report also details the grooming of a Twitter employee, Ali Azabara, who was convinced by the Saudis to access a number of target Twitter accounts. Al-Zabara was fired by the tech giant in 2015. And the New York Times reports the U.S. consulting firm McKinsey & Company carried out research that the Saudi government used to target dissidents. In Afghanistan, voters turned out in large numbers to vote in the country's parliamentary elections over the weekend amidst violence and deadly attacks. And Afghan officials said 27 people were killed, 100 wounded across Afghanistan on Election Day, including at least 18 people killed by a suicide bomber Saturday as they waited to cast ballots. This comes days after the Taliban claimed responsibility for an attack that killed the top Afghan general Abdul Razik in the southern province of Kandahar, prompting a week's delay for voting in the region. The Pentagon said Sunday U.S. Army General Jeffrey Smiley was shot and wounded in that attack. The top U.S. general in Afghanistan, Scott Miller, was also a target of the attack, but survived uninjured. The summit was a far higher-level meeting than was previously believed. The elections, which were postponed 3 times due to security concerns, saw a record number of women and young people running for the 250 parliamentary seats. Preliminary results are expected in November. In Gaza, Israeli forces shot and injured at least 130 Palestinians on Friday as protesters gathered near the Gaza Strip separation barrier with Israel. Gaza's health ministry says 25 children and 4 paramedics were among the injured. The demonstration was the latest under the banner of the Great March of Return, which started March 30th. Israeli forces have killed over 200 Palestinians and injured at least another 18,000, according to Gaza health officials. Meanwhile, Israel's postponed plans to evict 180 Palestinian Bedouins from the village of Khan al-Ahmar in the occupied West Bank to make way for the expansion of 2 nearby Jewish-only settlements. Israel's come under international pressure from the United Nations and the European Union not to demolish the village. Earlier this month, a prosecutor with the International Criminal Court said the planned demolition could constitute a war crime. A migrant caravan making its way to the U.S. border from Central America crossed into Mexico this weekend amidst ongoing threats by President Trump. Hundreds became stranded on a border bridge between Guatemala and Mexico as fences blocked their entry into Mexico, with some spending the night on the open-air bridge. Many eventually resorted to swimming or crossing the river in makeshift rafts, although reports of clashes with Mexican forces at the Guatemala-Mexico border emerged over the weekend. The caravan's estimated to have topped 7,000 people as it continues to make its way north. This is Honduran migrant Mario.
We asked the government of this country to give us a hand, to allow us through. It's very complicated in our country. Honduras is complicated. We really don't want to be there. That's the truth. The poverty is terrible. We have children in Honduras to support, and there is no work.
President Trump has repeatedly threatened to cancel a pending trade agreement with Mexico and send U.S. military troops to the southern border of the United States with Mexico unless the caravan turns around. In Honduras, a court has removed lawyers representing the slain environmentalist Berta Cáceres from the trial of 8 men accused of carrying out her murder. The victims' lawyers had called for the 3 judges trying the case to be replaced, accusing them of bias, abuse of authority, and of violating due process by prohibiting evidence. But on Friday, the judges rejected the motion, instead ordered Cáceres' lawyers removed from the court proceedings. Cáceres won the 2015 Goldman Environmental Prize for her work protecting indigenous communities before she was assassinated in 2016 as she led a campaign against a massive hydroelectric dam project. Back in the United States, the U.S. death toll from Hurricane Michael has risen to somewhere between 36 and 39 as recovery workers have taken to crowdsourcing information on social media sites in an effort to reunite about 300 people still unaccounted for or reported missing. Meanwhile, the Air Force has acknowledged that a number of its F-22 stealth fighter jets were damaged or destroyed as Hurricane Michael ripped through Tyndall Air Force Base, destroying the entire base, turning hangars into rubble. At least 17 of the F-22s, which cost $339 million each, were damaged or destroyed, meaning the cost of replacing them could amount to almost $6 billion. The Supreme Court has temporarily halted a landmark climate lawsuit brought by 21 young people who argue the government has failed to take necessary action to curtail fossil fuel emissions, violating their constitutional rights. The trial was set to begin in less than 2 weeks in a federal court in Eugene, Oregon. And in Britain, an estimated 700,000 people marched through the streets of London and rallied at Parliament Square Saturday, calling for a referendum on the final Brexit deal. Organizers say it was one of the largest protests of any kind in British history. Prime Minister Theresa May has ruled out any public referendum on her plans to withdraw the UK from the European Union. This is London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who joined Saturday's protests.
This government is leading us towards either a bad Brexit deal or, even worse, no deal at all. These options are a million miles away from what was promised. The government doesn't have a mandate to gamble with our future.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. President Trump has announced plans to pull the United States out of a landmark nuclear arms pact with Russia in a move that could spark a new arms race. President Ronald Reagan and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF, in 1987. The INF banned all nuclear and non-nuclear missiles with short and medium ranges. The treaty helped to eliminate thousands of land-based missiles. On Saturday, Trump vowed to build new nuclear weapons.
We'll have to develop those weapons. Unless Russia comes to us and China comes to us and they all come to us and they say, let's really get smart and let's none of us develop those weapons. But if Russia's doing it and if China's doing it and we're adhering to the agreement, that's unacceptable. So we have a tremendous amount of money to play with on our military, $700 billion plus $716 billion. So Russia has not adhered to the agreement, so we are going to terminate the agreement and we are going to develop the weapons. If they get smart, and if others get smart and they say, let's not develop these horrible nuclear weapons, I would be extremely happy with that. But as long as somebody's violating that agreement, then we're not going to be the only one to adhere to it. I think you understand that.
President Trump did not offer details on how Russia was violating the INF Treaty. Over the years, Russia has also accused the United States of violating the agreement by deploying a missile defense shield in Romania. National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's advocated against the treaty, is now in Moscow for talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and President Vladimir Putin. Bolton has also opposed the extension of the 2010 New START agreement with Russia, which limited the number of deployed nuclear warheads on either side to 1,550.
President Trump's plan to pull out of the nuclear arms deal has been criticized around the globe. Former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who co-signed the deal in 1987, said, quote, "Do they really not understand in Washington what this could lead to? Quitting the INF is a mistake," Gorbachev said. China and France spoke out against the move, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying the document has an important role in developing international relations and nuclear disarmament and in maintaining global strategic balance and stability, unquote. To talk more about the implications of the U.S. withdrawal, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Daryl Kimball, director of the Arms Control Association. He previously led the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, has been advocating for the U.S. and Russia to preserve the INF Treaty. Welcome to Democracy Now! Were you shocked by President Trump's announcement on Saturday? And explain exactly what it means, Daryl Kimball.
Well, I was not shocked because this appears to be a John Bolton-inspired decision by Donald Trump to pull out of this very important agreement, which has, eliminated, as you said, an entire class of intermediate-range missiles that once threatened Europe. 2,692 U.S. and Soviet missiles were verifiably eliminated as a result of this treaty. Russia has been testing a ground-launched cruise missile that the U.S. says was tested in excess of the range limit established by the treaty. They have not exhausted all the diplomatic opportunities that are available to resolve this issue. We've been working on that. And what Trump has done is I think he has very prematurely, at best, to put a kind interpretation on it, pulled the United States out of the treaty, shifting blame from Russia to President Trump for blowing up this very important agreement that's important for U.S. and European and Russian security. And it does absolutely nothing to bring Russia back into compliance with the treaty. And it opens the door for Russia to deploy in greater numbers this missile of concern, which is known as the 9M729. If Russia wants to, if this treaty is gone, all the constraints on the testing, the production, and the deployment of these missiles in Europe and elsewhere will be gone. And then Trump says, if Russia and China don't abide by this treaty, we're going to have to build missiles of this type. That kind of logic simply doesn't make any sense, given a few basic facts. One is China wasn't party to the INF Treaty. The U.S. and Russia have been. The United States doesn't need ground-launched intermediate-range missiles to deal with China. In fact, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff last year said explicitly we do not need such missiles to counter China. And the United States doesn't have any such missile in development, and there's no NATO country that would accept any such ground-launched cruise missile to be deployed in their territory. The last time that happened, back in 1983, there were millions of Europeans in the streets telling Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to get rid of those missiles. So for a number of reasons, this is counterproductive, it's dangerous, and it does open the door to the possibility of renewed nuclear competition in this area. And it could threaten another important treaty, the new Strategic Arms Treaty, the main treaty limiting the two sides' strategic arsenals, which is due to expire in 2021 if Trump and Putin don't extend it.
Well, let's go back to the 1987 summit when President Reagan and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons Treaty, INF. Reagan talked about the significance of the deal.
The numbers alone demonstrate the value of this agreement. On the Soviet side, over 1,500 deployed warheads will be removed, and all ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, including the SS-20s, will be destroyed. On our side, our entire complement of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles, with some 400 deployed warheads, will all be destroyed. Additional backup missiles on both sides will also be destroyed.
So that's President Reagan speaking in 1987 about the importance of this agreement. Now, you spoke, Daryl, about the fact that Russia was violating this treaty, but Russia has also accused the U.S. of violating the treaty. Is there any truth to that?
Well, Russia has said they have deep concerns about whether the United States could convert defensive missile interceptors that are part of the U.S. missile defense architecture that are now in Romania and will be in Poland for offensive purposes. So they have said that that is a problem they have. And so, look, if we look at the situation, the United States has serious concerns about Russia's compliance. The Russians have concerns about U.S. future compliance. What really ought to happen is there should be a arrangement by which there are transparency visits by technical experts to examine these missiles of concern, and the two sides could conceivably work out an arrangement by which each side's concerns are addressed. And if Russia does have missiles that can fly in excess of the treaty limits, they could be called upon to stop deployment. But the two sides haven't gotten this far. There have not been discussions at the detailed expert level about how to resolve this. In fact, there have only been 2 meetings on the INF issue between U.S. and Russian officials since Trump came into office.
I mean, can you talk about how many weapons does the United States have? How many does Russia have? Is this just a gift to the weapons manufacturers? Just no holds barred, take all restraints off?
Well, look, you're right, Amy. We got to put all this in perspective. Even though the Cold War is over, so to speak, the weapons that were created during the Cold War still exist, and the nuclear strategies that the United States and Russia had at that time are still very much in place. So, as we sit here this morning chatting about this, the United States deploys about 1,400 warheads on long-range bombers and missiles on land and on sea. The Russians have equivalent numbers. About 800 of those could be launched on an order from the president within about 20 minutes. So that means that both sides remain on hair trigger. If there is a warning of an attack, the nuclear strategies call for the immediate launch of 800 or more nuclear warheads in retaliation. So that creates the chance for miscalculation. So we have massive overkill. We have a situation in which the fate of literally hundreds of millions of people rest in the hands of a small number of people, specifically 2 gentlemen, Trump and Putin. So we're talking about making this situation worse by removing one of the treaties that was negotiated in the 80s by none other than Ronald Reagan that helped end the Cold War. So this does reopen the possibility of a new arms race, which, of course, would certainly benefit the weapons contractors that would build any new weapons.
So, Daryl, could you give us a sense, before we conclude, what is at stake with the New START treaty? And does this give an indication that Trump will pull out of this? I mean, Bolton has been opposed to that as well.
Well, Bolton, before he came into office, he wanted to pull out of the INF treaty. He has said negative things about the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So that treaty was negotiated by Barack Obama in 2010. It's scheduled to expire in February 5, 2021, just a few days after the next inauguration day. Trump and Putin could, however, agree to extend it by 5 years, along with the transparency and verification provisions that are very important. And right now, John Bolton is leading an interagency review about whether to extend the treaty, trash the treaty, or try to renegotiate some new treaty in the little amount of time left between now and 2021. So, you know, if we look at this INF decision, I'm very worried that John Bolton is headed in the same direction with respect to the New START treaty. And if that's the case, we would not have legally binding limits on the world's two largest arsenals for the first time since 1972. So it's very important for Congress to step up, Republicans and Democrats who support the New START treaty, to press Trump to extend this treaty, to buy us some more time so that we can at least have these limits in place and pursue further negotiations with Russia to further reduce the bloated and costly arsenals of these two countries.
And finally, we just have 30 seconds, but even though this is an agreement between the U.S., or it was, and is it actually Trump saying we're pulling out, meaning we have pulled out, isn't this also a message to China that President Trump is sending?
Well, he may think so. I don't think the Chinese are particularly perturbed. You know, China has most of its arsenal on ground-launched missiles with a medium or intermediate range. It just has to do with geography. They're under no pressure to join the INF treaty. And they have a relatively small, about 300 nuclear weapons arsenals that they feel is sufficient to deter the United States. So he may think he's sending a message to China, but I don't think it's a very effective one.
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean? Is the U.S. out since Trump said they are?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, these discussions between John Bolton and the Russians today in Moscow, I think, will be key. It is not clear whether Trump is actually pulling out. It may be that they're trying to threaten that the U.S. will pull out if Russia doesn't do something in particular. That's not clear. My Russian contacts have not yet heard anything like that. Our European allies have not heard anything like that. But I think it's quite likely, if we remain on the current track, that the INF treaty will be terminated by Donald Trump sometime in 2019.
Darrell Kimball, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of the Arms Control Association, previously led the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report, of course, will continue to report on the U.S.-Russia INF treaty. When we come back, a change in trans policy on the part of the Trump administration. Stay with us.
Mírame, ¿dónde está la esperanza? ¿Dónde me ves la vida? ¿Dónde voy a vivir? Mírame, ya no tengo la calma, ya me caí de la cama, me voy a envenenar. Ay, soy un niño asustado, tengo el ritmo apagado, bailo sin respirar. Mírame, me ahogo en tu piscina.
Meridian Brothers here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The New York Times is reporting the Trump administration is attempting to eliminate the rights of transgender people by creating a narrow legal definition of gender. Citing a government memo, the Times reveals that the Department of Health and Human Services has undertaken an effort across several government agencies to establish a legal definition of sex under Title IX, the federal civil rights law that bans discrimination on the basis of sex. That definition would be either male or female, unchangeable, and determined by the genitals a person is born with. According to the Times, the memo says, quote, sex means a person's status as male or female based on immutable biological traits identifiable by or before birth. The sex listed on a person's birth certificate, as originally issued, shall constitute definitive proof of a person's sex.
If enacted, the proposal would reverse the expansion of transgender rights that took place under President Barack Obama. On Sunday night, hundreds of LGBTQ activists held an emergency rally in New York's Washington Square to protest the proposal. Groups plan another demonstration today in Washington, D.C. For more, we're joined by Chase Strangio, staff attorney at the ACLU. Chase was at last night's rally. Welcome back to Democracy Now! So, Chase, start off by talking about what exactly this memo says. I think the poster people were carrying last night, hell no to the memo. This report that the administration is considering narrowly defining gender as a biological condition determined by genitalia at birth.
So this is part of the Trump administration's widespread effort to attack trans rights. And in this case, it's a memo that was written months ago that is part of an effort to restrict the federal civil rights laws so that trans people aren't protected. Now, it's being touted as this effort to erase trans people, and I think that's certainly what many in the administration would like to do. That's what we saw with the military ban. That's what we saw with the memo with respect to prisons. But the reality is that the executive branch of government cannot single-handedly change the law. So this is an effort to narrow federal civil rights protections, but federal civil rights protections are still written by Congress, existing in federal law, and interpreted by the courts. So this is certainly not the final word on anything, but it is part of a widespread attack on the trans community that we've seen across the administration.
Well, can you talk about what's been happening at the state level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just to take a step back, this effort to define what people are calling quote unquote biological sex is really a concerted effort to both situate trans people outside the law and to claim that our bodies are really a threat to others. And we saw this in 2015 and 2016 in North Carolina and elsewhere with HB2, for example, in North Carolina, which was really an effort to push trans people out of public life. And now, 2 years later, the people who were defending HB2 have high-level positions in the federal government, and so we're seeing an effort to implement this at the federal level.
Explain what HB2 is again for people who might not remember in North Carolina.
HB2 was the law in North Carolina that passed in 2016 that barred transgender people from using facilities that matched our genders. That passed quickly in a special session in North Carolina. The people who were defending HB2 in court now have incredibly high-level positions in the federal government. Head of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the Solicitor General of the United States, and a federal judge on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So the very people who are orchestrating a systematic attack on trans people at the state level are now running things at the federal government. That's both true with respect to HB2, but it's also true with respect to the many groups that have had coordinated attacks on the LGBT community for decades. So people who have been involved with Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, are now the people who are not only in the federal government, but who are running the quote-unquote civil rights divisions of federal executive agencies. And it has been their mission to attack trans people for years, if not decades. And so that's what we're seeing, an effort to restrict the ability of trans people to get legal protections.
Well, could you explain what would the effects of this be on transgender people if there is this narrow definition of biological, as you say, so-called biological sex?
So I think there's two things we should be looking at. The first is that this is an effort to restrict federal civil rights laws. What that would mean is that it would restrict the ability of transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming people, and actually all people to access protections under federal law that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in education, housing, employment. So there's that effort to restrict the law in that way. Again, the courts are going to be the ones to interpret this in the end, and Congress could come in and make changes to anything the executive did. So there's that effort. And then there's this larger sort of discursive cultural effort to tell the world that there is no such thing as a trans person, that you are born with a sex and that can never be changed. And this is an insidious effort to tell the world and sort of fuel this idea that trans people are always fraudulent, that somehow the truth of our bodies and our so-called biology is going to be betrayed. And this is also what fuels violence against so many trans people, especially trans people of color.
Because
what happens is there's this idea that trans people are inauthentic, that we're out here to deceive you. But the reality is that we are who we say we are, and that biological sex as the other side, as the right, as people in power in the Trump administration are trying to talk about it is not a scientific fact. It's an ideological effort to tell people that trans existence isn't real. And so then what happens is on the streets, people say, oh, you're really a man to a woman who is trans, and that is is precisely what fuels the violence against so many in the trans community.
Explain what the federal law and the rules are now and how this memo indicates they will be changed.
Right now, federal civil rights law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. The courts have long understood that that includes discrimination against trans people and anyone who departs from sex stereotypes. So this is not new. The New York Times was incorrect in saying that the Obama administration, quote unquote, loosened the definition of gender or sex. That is not what happened. The law has been clear for decades. The Obama administration offered interpretive guidance consistent with that. The effort now is to offer new interpretation that will conflict with the federal law as interpreted by the courts. And so this is not something that the Trump administration can do single-handedly, but it is an effort to exclude trans people from civil rights protections. And we have to stay vigilant. And I think it's also important to remember that federal law is not the only source of protections for people. There is state law, there is local law, and it is so easy for us to get caught up with what the Trump administration is doing when there is so much happening at the state level. And I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that in November, on November 6th, there is an incredibly important vote in Massachusetts where Massachusetts passed through their legislature protections for transgender people, and now there's an effort to repeal those at the ballot. So if we allow these things to happen in the states, then we absolutely are going to see this expansive attack at the federal government.
Well, can we also talk about how the media has been covering this? You've been very critical of this New York Times piece that just came out. Transgender could be defined out of existence under Trump administration. So what is it about the language that's being deployed, about the people who are being asked to speak and to write on this issue that you're critical of?
I have long been very critical of the New York Times trans coverage, and that's true of yesterday's article as well. I think it was an incendiary headline designed to get clicks. It absolutely is true that trans people are under attack, but the idea that trans people's existence is up for a debate is precisely the paradigm that the New York Times has fueled over the years of its coverage, suggesting that there are two sides to an argument about whether trans people exist. Trans people exist, full stop. It is not up for debate. And the New York Times, The Guardian, right now in the UK, there's a conversation about the Gender Recognition Act there. The Guardian has been publishing editorials about whether or not, which side of the argument people support. It is not an argument about whether people exist. We exist. And the more we have ideological debate about whether or not it's moral or ethical to recognize the existence of trans people, the more we're going to embolden the Trump administration and other state-level government actors to act to take away our rights. This isn't a debate. It doesn't violate anyone else's rights for trans people to have rights.
Well, how would you respond to those who say that framing the conversation in this way is a way of persuading people? Now, of course, as you say, these transgender people, of course, they exist. But if the other argument is put forward, then perhaps people who aren't persuaded of this will be persuaded.
I think the concern is that we're hearing a debate about trans existence that's not being led by trans people. And so much of what we're seeing is this understanding of transness that really entrenches this notion that there's some biological truth of sex and something else that's ideological called gender. And that really is a false dichotomy. And what we're seeing is that by saying that there's something called science that's true.
It's interesting that the administration is using science to defend.
Yeah, all of a sudden they care about science. But the reality is that I think what I want people to really understand is there may be things that are typically true in science. So, for example, it may be typically true that men have certain bodies, but it's a political choice to make that definitional, to say men have to have certain bodies in order to be men. And I think what we have to understand is that these are political choices that are part of a long legacy that is very much connected to colonialism, white supremacy, and efforts to exclude people from participation in society.
Where do you think is the best place to get information on trans issues?
I think the best place to get information on trans issues is from trans people. So we can look at publications that have trans writers, whether that's broadly at Vice, Them, Condé Nast publication, Teen Vogue. The voices of trans people have long challenged the way this conversation has been framed in places like the New York Times. The New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian are regularly running pieces attacking whether or not trans people can and should exist.
As we begin to wrap up, you are Chelsea Manning's lawyer. Chelsea just tweeted this weekend After almost a decade of fighting through prison, the courts, a hunger strike, and through the insurance company, I finally got surgery this week. She later tweeted, "Laws don't determine our existence. We determine our existence. It's our weapon, our shelter, our energy, our healer, our truth. We will keep moving forward. We will keep fighting. Existence is our only law." Last comment on Chelsea.
I just want to say I'm so proud of Chelsea. I'm so happy to see her getting the health care that she needs. I hope other trans people will also get that health care. And I just want to say to the trans community, this is a terrifying time. People were breaking out into tears yesterday. I know people are scared, but we have a long history of resistance, and we will continue to fight, and we absolutely will survive.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Chase Strangio, for joining us, staff attorney at the ACLU. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we return to our conversation with the head of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. For the first time, they officially testified before the UN Security Council last week. Stay with us. Get lifted, Ms. June. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with the ongoing siege on Gaza after 130 Palestinians were injured Friday while protesting the ongoing Israeli occupation and demanding the right of return. 25 children and 4 paramedics were among the injured. Israel announced it was implementing a, quote, zero-tolerance policy towards protesters in Gaza shortly before 10,000 protesters gathered along Israel's heavily militarized separation barrier with Gaza as part of their weekly Friday protests under the banner of the Great March of Return. The protests began March 30th, and since then, Israeli forces have killed at least 170 Palestinians, including more than 30 children, and injured tens of thousands more.
Meanwhile, Israel has postponed the planned demolition of the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar in the occupied West Bank after facing international condemnation. Last week, the International Criminal Court warned Israel that population transfers in occupied territories constitute war crimes. We return now to part 2 of our conversation with Haggai Elad, the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. He was in New York last week on Thursday when he testified before the UN Security Council officially for the first time. I asked Haggai about his message to the world.
So what was key for us is really try to spell out the daily reality for a Palestinian living under occupation in the moments that don't necessarily make the news, when soldiers enter a Palestinian home in the dead of night. And people abroad might assume that they have a search warrant or probable cause or something like that. But no, military law gives almost any soldier the authority to enter any Palestinian home anytime, and the army does. And a million other ways in which Palestinians, day in and day out, have absolutely no control over their lives, have no representation in the Israeli institutions that determine everything in the life of a Palestinian, and to try and explain that, to give flesh and blood to the meaning of living under that regime, not for a month, not for a year, not for a decade, an entire people for more than half a century in that reality.
And there you're talking about the West Bank. In Gaza, people are being killed regularly. There's the Great March of Return protests that began on March 30th. And your official figures for how many people the Israeli military has killed since then?
Yeah, it's more than 170 fatalities, more than 30 of them were minors, under 18. 3 of them were actually children. They were 11 years old. These are the youngest ones that were killed since March 30, and more than 5,300 that were injured from live gunfire. But it's really important for me to emphasize that Gaza is also another example of Israeli control. Israel controls everything between the river and the sea. In Gaza, the control is external. We decide what and who gets in and out of the Gaza Strip, except of the Rafah crossing with Egypt that is closed most of the time. We control the population registry in Gaza. If you're a Palestinian in Gaza and you need medical care, not necessarily even in Israel. You need medical care in the West Bank or in Jordan. Then, you need an Israeli permit for that. We control everything in different ways, directly or indirectly.
I wanted to ask you about Israel's plans to demolish the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar. On Monday, Israeli forces arrested 4 villagers, injured 7 people as they protested the arrival of the demolition teams. This is Bedouin villager Ahmad Abu Dahouk speaking last month.
We ask all the free people in the Arab nation to react. It is a war crime. The Israeli authorities want to demolish and evacuate us. Are they going to send us to a better place? No, they will not. They will relocate us to a worse place.
He is speaking from Khan al-Ahmar. Explain what this place is and what's happening.
So this is just a few miles east of Jerusalem in a part of the West Bank known as Area C. That's about 60% of the West Bank, and that's in an area that has been high up on the Israeli list of priorities for a while to minimize Palestinian footprint there, to displace many Palestinians out of that area, and to expand settlements in there. And it exposes in great detail the Israeli hypocrisy in its planning policies used against Palestinians living in the West Bank. There was a letter by the Israeli ambassador actually to the Security Council just a day before my briefing trying to articulate the Israeli argument somehow as if what is about to happen is legal. Why is it legal? Because the Palestinians have been building illegally. Why is it legal? Because this was backed by the Israeli High Court of Justice. Why is this legal? Because Israel was kind enough to offer relocation sites to the community. And all of this are just lies on top of distortions on top of lies. Why are Palestinians building illegally? Because Israel created a planning regime that is meant to serve settlers and to dispossess Palestinians. If you're a Palestinian in Area C in the West Bank, your chances of getting a building permit for Israeli authorities are around 1 in 100. Right? So Palestinians have no other choice, and that's why they built without permission from Israeli authorities. And the Israeli High Court, when it makes a ruling that says that demolition orders are legal, while completely ignoring the context that Palestinians cannot build legally in any way, doesn't make that ruling just or sensible or even formally legal. It only makes the judges of the Israeli High Court complicit in what, if this is indeed will take place, will be the war crime of forcible transfer of protected people in an occupied territory. Khan al-Ahmar is the most visible example of this phenomena these days. A community of some 200 people in that location with a school that serves other communities in the area. But this is happening not only now and not only in Khan al-Ahmar. This is part of a broader Israeli policy to take over as much Palestinian land, minimize Palestinian footprint, concentrate as many Palestinians as possible in the parts of the West Bank known as Area A and Area B, and then say that those areas, like Area A, hey, don't worry about that. That's where Palestinians are running their own lives. Well, in fact, what we're talking about are isolated Bantustans that are getting more and more closed by further and further Israeli settlements in the rest of the West Bank. And in the end, what you have is this picture in which Palestinian life and Palestinian territory and the Palestinian people and spirit are completely broken up into small, digestible, more easily controllable areas. Gaza separated from the West Bank. East Jerusalem walled off the rest of the West Bank. The West Bank itself chopped into these different segments.
You referenced apartheid in your speech to the UN Security Council. You said, take a look at the discriminatory planning mechanisms and the separate legal systems in the occupied territories. They are reminiscent of South Africa's grand apartheid.
Yeah, we try to make a nuanced point there because often if you make that point, Israel will say, how dare you compare these two realities? We don't have laws that say that Palestinians and Israelis cannot sit on the same benches, for instance. And indeed, we don't. But that's why the distinction was made there between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Not those aspects of apartheid, the benches, the separate beaches, and so on and so forth. And I'm not talking here about restrictions on movement, but to focus on the issue of the policies, the legal systems, and, of course, voting rights.
You also wrote in Haaretz, What are the Palestinians supposed to do? If they dare demonstrate, it's popular terror. If they call for sanctions, it's economic terror. If they pursue legal means, it's judicial terror. If they turn to the United Nations, it's diplomatic terror. It turns out anything a Palestinian does besides getting up in the morning and saying, thank you, Reis, thank you, master, is terror.
Yeah, this has become so routine in Israel. This has become so normalized after 50 years that people have difficulty even in accepting that basic right that people live under oppression, have the right to reject that reality. And any avenue that Palestinians try is met with one form or another of condemnation. But for Israel, this is part of a broader agenda. The agenda is not only to overcome Palestinian opposition to their oppression, but also to silence Israelis and to silence the international community. So it goes further, right? You know, if an Israeli is against occupation, she or he must be traitors. If an international is speaking or acting against the occupation, they must be anti-Semites, right? And I'm saying that with a lot of cynicism, but this is no laughing matter. This is actually quite an effective silencing mechanism that Israel is deploying continuously all over the world.
You know, this week the Pope sainted Archbishop Romero, Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980. The last speech he gave before he was gunned down was heard throughout El Salvador on the radio. And he ordered the soldiers, he beseeched them, he pled with them to put down their arms, to defy orders. He said, stop the repression. In April, your group, B'Tselem, called on Israeli soldiers to refuse orders to shoot unarmed protesters. Did they heed?
No. Yeah, we published ads. This is actually also like a legal responsibility, a moral responsibility, not only, I think, from like any decent person, but also according to Israelis' own laws. If a soldier receives a flagrantly illegal command, he is duty-bound not to follow that command. It commands that order soldiers to fire at unarmed protesters that are not endangering anyone from a distance. These are flagrantly illegal commands. They should not have been given, and the responsibility for that is with the country's leadership, with the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, Chief of Staff, and that's where the responsibility begins. That's where the brunt of the responsibility is. But if such orders are given, soldiers are duty-bound not to follow such orders.
I wanted to turn to an emergency room doctor who he interviewed. He's a Canadian doctor, and he went to Gaza to help Palestinians. The Palestinian-Canadian doctor, Tarek Loubani, who was shot by Israeli forces in both legs while he was helping treat Palestinians injured by Israeli forces during the nonviolent Great March of Return. It was May 14th. It was a Monday. I asked Dr. Loubani, this is right after he was shot, if he felt he was targeted as a doctor.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what orders they received or what was in their heads. So I can't tell you if we were deliberately targeted. What I can tell you is the things that I do know. In the 6 weeks of the march, there were no paramedic casualties. And in one day, 19 paramedics, 18 wounded plus 1 killed, and myself were all injured. We're all shot with live ammunition. Musa was actually in a rescue at the time, but everybody else I've talked to was like me. We were away during a lull without smoke, without any chaos at all, and we were targeted, and we were rather hit by live ammunition, most of us in the lower limbs.
So that was Dr. Tarek Loubani, the Canadian Palestinian doctor. We spoke to him just after he was shot. The man he was talking about, paramedic Musa Abu Hassanin, was shot and killed by Israeli forces. He was shot in the chest. Dr. Loubani tweeted a photo captioned, "A haunting photo. Friday, May 11th. Left. Mohammed Migdad, shot in the right ankle. Hassan Abu Sada. Tarek Loubani, shot in left leg and right knee. Mumin Silmi, Yusuf Al-Mamluk, Musa Abu Hassanin, shot in the thorax and killed. Volunteer unknown. Photographer, shot and wounded." He said this was a photo they had just taken so they could have for their scrapbooks. Talk about this, Haggai.
There's a lot of information also about additional incidents, and I invite viewers to go to the B'Tselem website and read more data and analysis on this reality. What I would want to add is that one can be rest assured that in all likelihood, no one is going to be held accountable to any of these killings. Israel has a well-lubricated whitewashing mechanism that doesn't really investigate. It performs what looks like investigation in order to push against international legal authority. Sometimes it will take a very long time until they will close the case, sometimes a shorter time. But based on our data analysis, more than a decade of working on such issues, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, more than 97% of the time, no one will be held accountable.
Let me ask you about the criticism that you faced in Israel. 2 years ago, our guest, Haggai Elad, spoke first before the United Nations Security Council. The Israeli government threatened to revoke his citizenship. He was then barred from speaking at Israeli schools. Then this is Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, speaking yesterday.
Mr. Elad, you are a citizen of the State of Israel who serves our enemies. They are using you against us. IDF soldiers protect you, and you come here and smear them. Shame on you. Shame on you. You collaborator.
Shame on you, you collaborated, the Israeli ambassador to the UN said. Haggai Elad, your response?
He said it in Hebrew. No one could understand that in real time at the Security Council chamber, and of course he knew that. He was talking to an Israeli audience back home when he was saying that. 20 seconds before that, he was speaking in English from the same very seat, celebrating Israeli democracy because, hey, we have human rights organizations such as B'Tselem that get to present before the Security Council. It's a perfect example of Israeli hypocrisy at its worst, in the sense that democracy is reduced to a product for export. That's what we celebrate abroad, the only democracy in the Middle East. But at home, going after the traitors, trying to silence the opposition to the occupation, both things at the same time. By this point, I'm already used to having both of these voices, but usually it will be the Prime Minister and then someone else speaking 5 days later somewhere else, right? But to have the same person within less than a minute do democracy in English, collaborator in Hebrew, absolutely amazing. But to have like a deep understanding of how cynical that is, that's all you need to look at.
What about the Trump administration? Has it changed what's happening on the ground in Israel and the occupied territories? What about the Trump administration's relationship, President Trump, Jared Kushner's relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Prime Minister Netanyahu, his inner circle is increasingly being arrested. The latest charges brought against his own wife, moving in on Benjamin Netanyahu himself, and we see this, something similar happening in the United States with an investigation of President Trump. But what's happening?
I don't want to overcredit Trump and Netanyahu. They haven't begun this. They have both inherited this reality that has begun many years before that in Israel by governments left, right, and center that were part of the occupation project. I don't want to shy away from that history in that context. At the same time, of course, Trump is making everything much worse. And the sense in Israel of like this government that not only they have a green light from the White House to basically get away with almost anything they want to do, but in fact that what they have here is, from their perspective, a concern, a limited time, window of opportunity in which to advance Israel's occupation project with no fear of consequences from the U.S., with no fear of anything happening at the Security Council because of the American veto. And that is scary.
That was Haggai Elad, the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, in New York last week, where he testified before the UN Security Council officially for the first time. I'll be speaking in Aliso Viejo in Orange County, California, Wednesday night at Soka University. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.